Daenerys Targaryen didn't become mad in the final season of Game of Thrones. She was always mad. We just didn't want to see it. Because madness, when wrapped in the guise of maternal love and liberation, becomes the most seductive and dangerous form of tyranny the world has ever known. This is not the story of a hero's fall. This is the chronicle of how the great mother archetype, when corrupted by absolute power, transforms into something far more terrifying than any male tyrant could ever be. Because while men destroy through conquest, women destroy through love. And there is no force more devastating than maternal love turned possessive, protective instincts turned controlling, and the nurturing impulse twisted into the need to be worshipped as a goddess. For 8 seasons, millions of viewers watched Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, first of her name, the Unburnt, Queen of the Undulls and the First Men, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, Breaker of Chains and Mother of Dragons. But they missed the most crucial title of all, the False Mother. The woman who promised to break chains while forging new ones. Who spoke of liberation while demanding absolute submission. Who claimed to love her children while teaching them to burn those who dared to question her wisdom. The ancient Greeks understood something we have forgotten. They knew that the most dangerous gods were not the warriors or the kings, but the mother goddesses. Demeter, who could starve the entire world when her daughter was taken. Hera, who tortured innocents for her husband's crimes. The Great Mother, when scorned or threatened, becomes the terrible mother. And in Daenerys Targaryen, George R.R. Martin gave us the most perfect modern incarnation of this ancient archetype. But let us begin at the beginning, before the dragons, before the throne, before the burning. Let us begin with a 13-year-old girl being sold like cattle to a horse lord, and trace the exact moment when trauma transformed into purpose, when pain became power, and when a victim chose to become a goddess rather than heal as a human. The wedding night between Daenerys and Khal Drogo was not love. It was rape. But something extraordinary happened in that violation. Instead of breaking, Daenerys discovered the intoxicating power of transformation through suffering. She learned that pain could be alchemized into control, that victimhood could be weaponized into dominion. This was her first taste of the drug that would eventually consume her, the ability to transform trauma into transcendence through the subjugation of others. Watch how she handles Drogo. She doesn't heal from the assault. She doesn't process the trauma. Instead, she inverts the power dynamic. She becomes the sexual aggressor, the one who controls the encounter. This isn't healing. This is the first manifestation of what will become her core pathology, the inability to process pain except through the exercise of power over others. When she receives her dragon eggs, the symbolism is perfect. 3 fossilized children, seemingly dead, waiting for fire and blood to bring them to life. The dragons aren't just weapons. They're not just symbols of Targaryen power. They are her children, born from her own transformation through fire and blood. They are the physical manifestation of her maternal archetype twisted into something monstrous. The pyre scene where she births her dragons is religious ecstasy, not political awakening. She steps into the flames not as a conqueror, but as a goddess embracing her divine nature. The dragons emerge not as tools of war, but as proof of her supernatural motherhood. And from that moment, Daenerys stops being human and starts being a deity. And gods, as we all know, don't negotiate with mortals. They demand worship. But here's what makes her transformation so insidious. She genuinely believes in her own benevolence. When she burns Miri Maz-Dur alive, she frames it as justice for murder. When she conquers cities, she calls it liberation. When she crucifies masters, she terms it righteous retribution. This isn't calculated evil. This is something far more dangerous. Absolute moral certainty wielded by unlimited power. The tragedy of Drogo's death reveals another crucial aspect of Daenerys's pathology. She doesn't mourn her husband as a wife mourns. She mourns him as a goddess mourns her first worshipper. Drogo represented something she would spend the rest of the series desperately seeking to recreate. Unconditional love married to absolute submission. A man who adored her completely while never questioning her judgment. This becomes her template for all relationships. Worship me completely or be destroyed. As she wanders the Red Waste, we see the birth of her messianic complex. Her small band of followers isn't a refugee group, it's her first congregation. She doesn't lead them to safety, she leads them to believe in her divine mission. And when they reach Qarth, her first question isn't about shelter or food. It's about dragons. About power. About being recognized as the goddess she believes herself to be. The House of the Undying sequence is crucial because it shows us Daenerys's true desires. She's offered visions of love, of peace, of family. But what does she choose? The throne room. Power. The Iron Throne. Even when presented with the possibility of healing and humanity, she chooses dominion. The vision of Drogo and their son isn't a temptation toward love, it's a temptation toward weakness. And she rejects it because gods don't get to be merely human. By the time she reaches Slaver's Bay, the transformation is complete. Daenerys has fully embraced the archetype of the Great Mother Liberator. But liberation in her mind requires the complete destruction of the existing order. She doesn't reform slavery, she obliterates it through fire and blood. She doesn't negotiate with masters, she crucifies them. She doesn't establish new systems of justice, she becomes the sole arbitrator of who lives and dies. The liberation of Slaver's Bay reveals the core contradiction of her maternal archetype. True mothers nurture growth. They guide their children toward independence. They prepare them to survive without constant protection. But Daenerys creates dependency. Her freed slaves don't become citizens, they become worshippers. They don't learn to govern themselves, they learn to adore her. She breaks their chains only to forge new ones made of gratitude and terror. Watch her face when the slaves of Yunkai hail her as Misa, mother. This is her drug. This is her addiction. The desperate, grateful love of those she has saved. But notice what she demands in return: complete loyalty, unquestioning obedience, and perpetual gratitude. She doesn't free slaves to make them equal. She frees them to make them her children. And children, in her mind, never get to grow up. The crucifixion of the masters in Meereen is presented as justice, but look closer at the psychology. Daenerys doesn't investigate which masters were cruel and which were kind. She doesn't establish courts or trials. She simply declares that all masters are guilty by virtue of their position and crucifies them in identical numbers to the slave children they crucified. This isn't justice, it's the symmetry of divine wrath. An eye for an eye, executed by someone who believes she has the right to be judge, jury, and executioner. But here's the crucial detail everyone misses: she enjoys it. Watch her face as the crosses are raised. This isn't a reluctant queen doing what must be done. This is a goddess savoring her righteousness. The suffering of those she deems evil feeds something in her soul that mere adoration cannot satisfy. She needs to punish the wicked as much as she needs to save the innocent. The Great Mother requires both creation and destruction to feel complete. The Fighting Pits controversy reveals another layer of her pathology. When some of her freed slaves ask to sell themselves back into slavery because they cannot survive in freedom, her response is revealing. She doesn't see this as a failure of her liberation program. She sees it as ingratitude, as betrayal of her maternal gift. She cannot comprehend that her children might want something other than what she has chosen for them. A true mother would adapt, would learn, would find new ways to help. But a goddess simply becomes angry that her gifts are not appreciated. Tyrion's arrival in Meereen is significant because he represents something Daenerys has rarely encountered: intellectual challenge without worship. He doesn't adore her. He analyzes her. And his suggestions, compromise, negotiation, gradual change, represent everything her goddess complex cannot tolerate. Gods don't compromise. They don't negotiate. They decree. But she needs his intellect, so she keeps him close while ignoring his wisdom. The relationship with Jorah Mormont is perhaps the purest example of what Daenerys craves. Jorah loves her completely, unconditionally, without hope of reciprocation. He will die for her, lie for her, kill for her, and ask for nothing in return but the privilege of serving her. This is her ideal relationship: worship without demands, devotion without questions, love without equality. When she banishes him, it's not because she doesn't love him. It's because his imperfection, spying on her, mars the purity of his worship. The Sons of the Harpy insurgency reveals how Daenerys handles dissent. She doesn't try to understand their grievances. She doesn't attempt to find common ground. She labels them terrorists and responds with increasing violence. Every attack reinforces her belief that those who oppose her are evil by definition. She cannot conceive that reasonable people might reasonably oppose her methods, because in her mind she is not a ruler making political decisions. She is a mother protecting her children from monsters. The burning of Mirri Maz Duur's nephew and the other former masters without trial shows us the evolution of her justice. Early in Slaver's Bay, she at least went through the motions of investigation. By the time we reach this point, mere suspicion is enough for execution. The Great Mother's protection becomes increasingly indistinguishable from the terrible Mother's wrath. And each escalation is justified by the previous escalation. Violence begets violence, but she sees only her righteousness, never the cycle she's perpetuating. The marriage to Hisdar Zo-Lorak is fascinating because it represents the one moment where Daenerys almost chooses compromise over control. But notice what she demands even in compromise: that he convert to her way of thinking, that he accept her fundamental righteousness, that he become another worshipper rather than an equal partner. She cannot conceive of a relationship where she might be wrong about something fundamental. The goddess does not learn from mortals. When Drogon arrives at the fighting pits, Daenerys's response is revealing. She doesn't try to control him. She doesn't try to prevent him from killing innocents. She climbs on his back and flies away. In this moment, she chooses her dragon child over her human children. She chooses the creature that embodies her power over the people who need her protection. The Great Mother, when forced to choose between her different children, chooses the one that makes her feel most godlike. The burning of the Khals in V's Dothrak completes her transformation from Great Mother to terrible goddess. She doesn't escape slavery, she embraces genocide. Every Khal dies not because they individually wronged her, but because they represent a system that dared to claim ownership over her. This isn't justice or even revenge, it's a religious purge. She emerges from the flames not as a woman who survived, but as a goddess who has demonstrated her divine nature through mass murder. The response of the Dothraki is crucial. They don't see a woman who outwitted her captors. They see a goddess who burned her enemies alive and walked through fire unscathed. Their worship isn't based on respect for her intelligence or strength. It's based on supernatural terror and awe. And Daenerys basks in it. This is what she wants. Not love based on understanding but worship based on fear of her divine power. By the time she sails for Westeros, Daenerys has assembled the perfect congregation. Former slaves who worship her as their savior. Dothraki who worship her as their goddess. Dragons who obey her as their mother. Advisors who either adore her unconditionally or serve her out of terror. She has created a world where every voice either praises her or is silenced. And she mistakes this echo chamber for universal truth. The conquest of Westeros represents the collision between Daenerys's goddess complex and political reality. In Essos, she could destroy existing systems and replace them with her personal rule. In Westeros, she encounters something far more challenging. People who have never heard of her, who owe her no gratitude, who judge her by her actions rather than her mythology. And she cannot comprehend why they don't immediately recognize her divine right to rule them. The meeting with Jon Snow changes everything, but not in the way most viewers understood. Jon represents something that threatens the very core of Daenerys's identity. Legitimacy she cannot claim through divine right. He is not just a political threat, he is an existential one. If Jon has a better claim to the throne, then her entire mythology crumbles. She is not the rightful queen. She is not the chosen one. She is just another conqueror with dragons. But more than that, Jon represents something even more dangerous to her psyche, the possibility of being loved without being worshipped. Jon sees her as a woman, not a goddess. He treats her as an equal, not a superior. He challenges her decisions not out of malice, but out of genuine care. And this terrifies her more than any army could, because it reveals the possibility of relationships that don't revolve around her divinity. The scene where Jon bends the knee is crucial because it shows us what Daenerys truly desires. Not love, worship. Not partnership, submission. Not respect, awe. When Jon finally calls her my queen, she doesn't feel love. She feels the restoration of proper cosmic order. The goddess has received the acknowledgement she deserves. The journey north of the wall reveals another aspect of her pathology. When she rescues the expedition beyond the wall, she loses Viserion. But watch her response. She doesn't mourn her dragon child as a mother would mourn. She weaponizes the loss. Viserion's death becomes evidence of Jon's debt to her, proof of her sacrifice, justification for demanding his total loyalty. Even her grief becomes a tool of control. The parentage revelation breaks something fundamental in Daenerys because it threatens the narrative that has sustained her entire adult life. If she is not the rightful heir, then every conquest was theft. If she is not the chosen one, then every execution was murder. If she is not the great mother come to save the world, then she is just another tyrant with a compelling origin story. The revelation doesn't make her mad. It reveals that her sanity was always dependent on a lie. Her response to the parentage revelation is telling. She immediately demands Jon's silence. Not because she fears for his safety but because she fears for her mythology. She cannot allow competing narratives to exist. The goddess cannot tolerate other gods. And when Jon refuses to lie for her, she begins to see him not as a lover or an ally, but as an existential threat to her divine identity. The final season's rapid descent into tyranny isn't character assassination. It's the logical conclusion of 8 seasons of psychological development. Every advisor who tried to counsel restraint is dead or dismissed. Every voice that might have provided balance is silenced. Daenerys has successfully created a world where only her will matters, and that world has made her incapable of seeing herself clearly. The burning of King's Landing is not madness, it's theology. Daenerys doesn't burn the city in a fit of rage. She burns it as a religious act. These people rejected her gift of liberation. They chose to hide behind walls rather than welcome her as their savior. Therefore they have revealed themselves to be irredeemably corrupt, worthy only of purification through fire. The Great Mother has become the cleansing flame, destroying the world to save it from itself. Watch her face as King's Landing burns. This is not the expression of someone who has lost control. This is the face of someone who has found perfect clarity. She is not destroying innocence, she is cleansing corruption. She is not committing genocide, she is performing surgery on a diseased world. In her mind, every death is a mercy, every scream is a prayer, every flame is a blessing. Her final conversation with Tyrion reveals the depth of her delusion. She speaks of building a better world as if she has not just committed the greatest atrocity in the history of Westeros. She cannot see the contradiction because in her theological framework, there is no contradiction. The goddess destroys so that she can create anew. The Great Mother kills her corrupted children so that pure ones can be born. When she addresses the unsullied and Dothraki after the burning, she doesn't speak as a conqueror addressing an army. She speaks as a prophet addressing the faithful. King's Landing was not a defeat or a tragedy, it was a victory over evil. The people who died were not innocents, they were obstacles to liberation. Her followers' cheers are not celebration of conquest, they are hosannas to their divine leader. The conversation with Jon in the throne room is the final revelation of what Daenerys has become. She doesn't try to justify the burning through military necessity or political strategy. She justifies it through moral superiority. Those people deserve to die because they opposed her. Future cities will deserve to burn if they refuse her gift of liberation. She has become the judge of all humanity, and she has found most of humanity wanting. Jon's assassination of Daenerys is not the murder of a lover or even the execution of a tyrant. It is deicide, the killing of a false goddess. And notice her expression as she dies, not surprise, not betrayal, but a kind of peaceful certainty. She dies believing in her own righteousness, convinced that she was the Great Mother come to save a world too corrupt to deserve salvation. But here's the most terrifying aspect of Daenerys' story, she was right about one thing. The world did need saving. Slavery was an abomination. The masters were cruel. The powerful did exploit the weak. Her initial diagnosis of the world's problems was largely accurate. What corrupted her was not the discovery of injustice, but the belief that she was uniquely qualified to be the solution to all injustice. This is the seductive danger of the Great Mother archetype when it becomes pathological. It begins with genuine compassion, real love, authentic desire to nurture and protect. But when that impulse is wedded to unlimited power and unchecked by genuine relationships, it transforms into something monstrous. The desire to nurture becomes the need to control. The impulse to protect becomes the compulsion to punish. The love of children becomes the demand for worship. Daenerys Targaryen represents the shadow side of feminine power, not feminine power as weakness, but feminine power as totalitarianism disguised as love. She shows us what happens when the maternal instinct is divorced from the humility that true motherhood requires. Real mothers know they will make mistakes. Real mothers accept that their children must eventually become independent. Real mothers understand that love sometimes means letting go. But false mothers, goddesses masquerading as caregivers, demand perfection from themselves and worship from others. They cannot admit error because gods do not err. They cannot allow independence because children who don't need their protection threaten their identity. They cannot let go because losing control means losing their divinity. The tragedy of Daenerys is not that she became evil. Evil would be simpler, more comprehensible. The tragedy is that she became something far more dangerous. A person so convinced of her own goodness that she lost the ability to see her own evil. She died believing she was the hero of her own story, the Great Mother come to save her ungrateful children from themselves. And perhaps most disturbing of all, she was beloved by millions of viewers right up until the end. Because we, like her followers, were seduced by the mythology. We wanted to believe in the beautiful young woman with dragons who spoke of breaking chains. We wanted to believe that power in the hands of someone with good intentions would somehow remain good. We wanted to believe that the Great Mother could save us all. But power doesn't corrupt despite good intentions, it corrupts through them. And the most dangerous tyrants are not those who embrace evil, but those who commit atrocities while believing themselves to be saviors. Daenerys Targaryen didn't fall from grace. She ascended to a throne built on a mountain of corpses, and she called that mountain liberation. In the end, Game of Thrones gave us the most perfect modern representation of an ancient truth, that the line between the great mother and the terrible mother is not as clear as we would like to believe. That maternal love, when it becomes possessive, protective instincts when they become controlling, and the desire to nurture when it becomes the need to dominate, can create monsters more terrifying than any masculine tyrant. Because when men destroy, we can see it coming. But when women destroy, they do it with love. And there is no force on earth more dangerous than love that has forgotten how to let go. Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen died believing she was the mother of dragons, the breaker of chains, the great liberator. History will remember her differently, as the woman who proved that even the most maternal heart can house a tyrant's soul, and that sometimes the greatest monsters are those who believe themselves to be angels. The dragons are dead. The great mother has fallen. But the lesson remains: beware of saviors who demand worship, liberators who brook no dissent, and mothers who love so fiercely that they would rather see their children dead than free. For in the end, there is no tyranny more absolute than the tyranny of love that has forgotten its own limits. This is the true legacy of Daenerys Targaryen, not the cautionary tale of power's corruption, but the revelation that corruption was always there, wrapped in silk and hidden behind good intentions, waiting for enough power to finally show its true face. She didn't become a monster. She revealed the monster she had always been, disguised as the mother we all wished we had. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all.